Hey, what is going on everyone? It's me, Mr. Mario, and today I'm going to be showing you all, if you have a PlayStation TV, a Vita TV, or of course a PlayStation Vita either 1 or 2000 model, how you can modify it using h-encore² or h-encore². I'm going to be using those interchangeably, but from here on out I'm going to refer to the system as the Vita and the exploit as h-encore. Either way, I'm going to be showing you how you can install this and get homebrew up and running on firmwares 3.65 all the way up to 3.72. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, I will be updating this system, so I'm going to be showing you all how to do that quite easily. So we're going to need to have a PC on hand. Now for this, I'm going to be using my system here and updating it to 3.72. I recommend, if you have to update to the lowest firmware you can. And that does sound a little bit complex, but I'll break it down like this. If you are on firmware 3.60, you are okay. You can actually use the 3.60 tutorials I have on my channel, which are easier to use and, in my opinion, the better method. If you're on a firmware below 3.60, then you should update to 3.60. And if you are on a firmware which is higher than 3.60 but lower than 3.65, it would be recommended to upgrade to firmware 3.65. If you're on 3.65 to 3.72, you can just stick to that firmware. Now, in order to check that, you can go into your settings over here and go to your system information. And here it's going to show your system software. So again, a little bit sacrilegious, but hey, I have to do this for the tutorial. I am on firmware 3.60, so I'm going to be updating to 3.72 just so I can satisfy that. But again, like I said, if you're on 3.60, stay on that. If you're lower, update to 3.60. If you're higher than 3.60, but you're lower than 3.65, update to 3.65. And if you're on any firmware from 3.65 to 3.72, just stay where you are at. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to exit out of this for now, and let's move over to the PC so we can get what we need. So there's going to be a few links down below in the description, but first of all, we are going to be using h-encore², which again, this does work for firmwares 3.65 all the way up to 3.72. One thing to note is right here, it does say you should not attempt downgrading using Modoru on firmware 3.71 or 3.72. So I need to keep that in mind, and I need to tell you all, if you are on firmwares 3.71 or 3.72, at this time, it is not advised to downgrade your firmware once you have modified your system. I do have another tutorial showing you how to use this little tool called Modoru, which is a downgrader piece of homebrew, but again, it's not at all recommended at this moment in time to perform this on 3.71 or 3.72 systems. So just keep that in mind. But going back to the requirements for h-encore², first of all, you are going to need to be on firmwares 3.65 all the way up to 3.72, depending on which one you're at. Again, if you're in that range, just stay where you are at. If you have a Vita 1000 model, you are going to need a memory card. However, if you have a Vita TV, PlayStation TV, or 2000, you're all good because you have internal memory. And finally, you're also going to need to have a PlayStation Network account linked to your device already for starting this tutorial. It does not need to be activated, thankfully, but you do need to have it on hand. TheFloW also mentions here, if it is not, then you must restore default settings in order to sign in, so keep that in mind. Now, the tool we're going to be using for this is FinalHE, or FinalHE for short, and I'm going to be showing you all of this here. So when you go to the GitHub page, you just need to go over to Releases, and download the latest release, and download this, FinalHE. And this is going to be the Windows version of it, because this guide is going to be using Windows. If you are connecting your Vita system using USB, then I would also recommend downloading the QCMA driver WinUSB and installing that. However, because I'm not going to be doing that and I'll be doing everything over my internal network here, I do not need that driver, but it would be recommended to have on hand because it is the best one, at least in my opinion and experience. Now this portion is going to cover how to upgrade your firmware if you are on a firmware lower than 3.65 but higher than 3.60. So I am going to have firmware 3.65 linked down below in the description, but for this example, I'm going to use 3.72 just so I can be on the latest for this exploit. So first of all, you will need your firmware file, which is going to come in a file like this, psv update.pup or updat. And you are also going to need FinalHE. So you can just right click and extract it into its own folder. And you can use something like 7-zip or WinRAR to do this. And once you open it, you're only going to get a few items right here. Again, this is only if you're on a firmware lower than 3.65. You can come up here, copy your firmware file, and paste it into the same directory as your FinalHE install. An additional note here, if this is anything but PSP2 updat, the file will not be recognized. So if you want to update your firmware, make sure it is PSP2 updat.pup, and if it is not, make sure you rename it accordingly. And now once you do that, double click on FinalHE. If doing this over your network, you might get something like this, such as an error in your firewall or just something that your firewall is blocking this. Go ahead and allow access. Once you have this open, it will tell you launch Content Manager on PS Vita and connect to computer, so let's do that. On your Vita, go down to Content Manager and start this up. Now go down to Copy Content and let it connect. Once this pops up, go down to PC, and you can either register a device or you can select your PC. If it is showing up like that in white as opposed to ghosted out, so to speak, that means that you have already registered. And the registration settings are quite easy to walk through, but either way, since my PC is showing up, you can press X and let it connect. Over at your PC, it will say it is connected to PS Vita, but do not click on anything here, just keep this up and running. On your Vita, it should say Update System Software, and if you press X on here, it should be able to deliver the system update. So again, I put in 3.72, and that is what I want to update to. Again, you should only do this if you're on 3.65, but I'm just going to go through the update process here. Alright, so now that we've upgraded the firmware, I'm going to go up to Settings, Start, go down to My System, and once you go into System Information, you should see that your firmware has been updated. So we can now exit out of that and now begin the process of modifying the system. So for this, we are going to need to transfer over h-encore. And for that, first of all, make sure you have your PlayStation Network account on the system itself. And once you do, go back over to your PC yet again. Over at your PC, if you still have Final h-encore open, close out of it, go into this folder, and if you did update, delete the update because we no longer need that, and now run FinalHE yet again. And be sure to tick this if you want to save some space, which is trim h-encore to 7 megabytes. And we're going to do the exact same thing on our system. So let's go back over to the system while FinalHE is running. Go down to your Content Manager and press Start. Now go down to Copy Content. And you should be configured right here. And once you are, go back over to your PC. Over here, you should notice your Vita is connected on your firmware version. And here, I would recommend ticking this to trim h-encore to 7 megabytes. Now, just as a heads up, when you do this, there is a chance that when you trim your h-encore install, it might not be as successful when you're running the exploit. So if you're having a lot of trouble running this, you might also want to run a non-trimmed version. But either way, for this, I'm just going to trim this, click on Let's Go. And what it's going to do is it's going to download the exploit game it needs. It's then going to modify it and present it to you so you can transfer it to your Vita. So now this is it. It's now telling you to go to your Content Manager, go down to your PS Vita applications, and transfer this over. So keep FinalHE up and running and go back to your Vita. For this, go down to Copy Content, PC to Vita System, Applications, PS Vita, and h-encore² should show up. So you can now tick this, go down to Copy, OK, and let it transfer over. If it fails to transfer over this time around, I also recommend closing out of your manager here and reopen it and try to copy the file again. So now with that copied over, we can exit out of this, and you should have a new application, which is h-encore². So you can press X on this and press X to launch this. And as you can see, the exploit is now running, thankfully. So now we can go to install HENkaku and press X. Now go down to download Vita shell and press X. Press X to exit out of this. And at this point, once this is up and running, you are able to run homebrew. So the way to test it is to go down to Vita shell and launch it. And if it launches, then you are all good to go. Now, because I have had a previous install of this, there might be some other settings that you might need to tweak. So the other ones that I would recommend are, let's get out of here. Let's go up to settings. And we need to go to HENkaku settings. So for this, you can press X on there. And a few things, I'd recommend enable PSN spoofing, enable unsafe homebrew, enable version spoofing, and for your spoofed version, you can just change this to whatever the latest version is. So since the latest firmware version is 3.72, I would recommend doing that. Go back, and you can modify anything else on here. One thing that I do like to do is unlink memory card. So typically on a internal storage, I would not recommend that. However, if you have a regular memory card, I would recommend unlinking. So you can do that if you want to. I'm not going to be doing it on my Vita here because I only have the internal storage. And I'll reboot my device to show you all how this works. Now, when you launch your system into a fresh install, every time you reboot the system or turn it on from a cold boot, you will not be able to run any homebrew. Doing so is going to result in an error like this, and that is completely normal. In order to run homebrew, you need to go to h-encore and run it one time. Now, funny enough, my system actually just restarted when I did that, so that is what I was talking about before, saying that you might run into some issues like that using h-encore². But regardless, let's just go down and run it. And typically in h-encore fashion, it runs much better if you don't run any other application prior to it. But once you get to this menu, you can just press the X button on exit. And now at this point, you are good to go and you can run all the homebrew you want to. And this will work just fine. You will be able to run all this homebrew with no issues as long as you only keep your Vita on or in sleep mode. If you turn off your Vita or restart your Vita, you have to launch h-encore in order to run your homebrew and all the other stuff that you might want to. Now, this is where I had talked about the firmware talks and such. 3.60 and 3.65 support something called Ensō, which allows you to run a modification on here, which will allow you to run HENkaku on boot, meaning that you don't have to launch this every single time. That's only on firmwares 3.60 and 3.65. I do have separate videos showing how to cover that if you're on either of those firmwares, but if you are on firmware 3.70 or lower, you can downgrade. If you're on 3.71 or 3.72, it's not advised to downgrade, but you are able to use h-encore here, and you can use all the other fun stuff. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this can always be succeeded and probably will be. So for example, if firmware 3.73 ends up coming out, do not update to it unless you want to lose your access to homebrew and other modifications. But what you can do is go to your settings, go into HENkaku settings, go down to spoofed version, and from there, you change your spoofed version manually, and then you can go to reboot device. And then that means that every time you end up launching h-encore, you're going to be spoofed to the latest firmware version, so you should be good to go without having to update your system's firmware. It is best with the Vita to keep your system on the lowest firmware possible and still have homebrew access and such. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to install homebrew. So for this, what we can do is go to Vita Shell and launch it. When you go into Vita Shell, what you can do is press the start button, and if you want to use USB, you can change this option to USB, and from there you'll be able to use USB whenever you press the select button. From there you just press the select button and it will bring up a prompt within Vita Shell to connect your USB to connect to your PC via USB, and from there you can transfer files from your Vita to your PC without needing the content manager and through USB. For that, I'd recommend just copy and paste the file that we're going to transfer directly over that way. But if you're going to do it through FTP, this one's a little bit harder, and that's why I'm going to be showing this. For this, we can change this to FTP, press back, make sure you are on a network connection, and when you're out here, press the select button, and now this is going to show up. It's going to give you an IP address as well as a port number. And once you have these, go over to your PC. If you still have FinalHE open, you no longer need it, so you can exit out of this and now go into a browser. Down in the description, I'm going to have a link to Vita Homebrew browser, and you can go down here and it'll give you some nice information and such, but you can just click the download button and then save it somewhere you can easily access it. The other thing is you will need a FTP client of some kind. So some people like FileZilla, some people use WinSCP. I'm going to be using WinSCP, which I'll have linked down below, and you can just download this and install it on your PC. Now once you open this up, it might look a little bit daunting, and I already have many things saved here, but what I'm going to do is go to New Site, make sure you're on New Site, go down to FTP, no encryption, type in your IP number, which is going to be the first set of numbers, so mine is 192.168.1.249, and your port number needs to be 1337, and you can tick this to do anonymous login. And now from here, I also recommend clicking the save button and save this as a connection, so you don't have to type this every single time. Since mine has already been set up before, I do have it on hand here already, so mine is as easy as clicking PSTV and clicking on login. And this will look a little bit daunting, but what we are accessing, at first it will look something like this. These are all of the directories that are available on your Vita's system. So what we need to access is UR0. This is your memory unit, whether it's your internal memory unit or your memory card, whichever one you are using. So go to UX0, and from here, I actually have a folder already called VPK, but I'd recommend if you don't have that, right click and create a new directory, and you can call it VPK and press OK. I already have this here, so I don't need that. On here, you do need to change directories to wherever you have saved your file. So from here, you can just select your drive and then navigate from there. But I'm going to do the Vita Homebrew browser. So right click, upload, OK, and let that transfer over. And once it's done, we can just exit out, close, and go back over to our system. At the system, press circle to cancel. Now go to UX0, go to wherever you saved this, go to the Vita Homebrew browser, press X on it, press X to install, and it is going to give you a warning here saying that this will need extended permissions, so you can press yes on here or the X button and let this install. So now you can just press the triangle button over this, and you can delete the VPK as we no longer need it. And now exit out of Vita Shell, and when you go back to your menu, you should have Vita Homebrew browser or whichever homebrew you're using. So make sure you're connected to the internet and then launch this. as it is loading, once it gets past those splash screens, it might stay at this black screen for a while. Make sure again you're connected to the internet and just let it sit here. This is typical for the first time you launch this browser. Now once this has all been set up, from here you can go down and pick whatever you are wanting to download. So for example, Repo Hub, this allows you to check out GitHub repos all on your Vita. So if you want to install something, you can just press the X button over it, and from here select the download button, which should just be pressing the X button, and from here it's going to download the VPK, unzip it, and install it all for you. So you don't have to worry about anything else. Once that's done, you can press the circle button, and if you exit out of here, it should show up on your main page. Another example, kind of just a shout out to one of my friends here in the Cat's Dreams. This is just a cool little application in which you can change your Vita's volume on the Vita itself as opposed to pressing the volume buttons. So I could even fire that off just for him. But as you can see, that is all there is to it. So you can experience the awesome world of Homebrew just by messing around with all of those. Anyways, that is about it for this tutorial. So what are some of the other things you can do? Well, I have other tutorials covering them, thankfully. If you want to play additional games which are no NP DRM compatible, I do have another tutorial showing you how to set that up. If you are on firmware 3.70 or lower, it would be recommended to downgrade to 3.60 firmware if possible, so I do have a tutorial covering that. In fact, I'm actually going to link my Vita playlist down below in the description, so you can check out what you'd like to and see exactly what you want to do. Anyways, again, that is about it. So this is Mr. Mario signing off. Thank you all for watching, everyone. If you've enjoyed this video, a like would absolutely be appreciated. If you didn't like it, a dislike is fine as well too, but let me know of some of the stuff you are going to be installing on your Vita.